I'd like to welcome you to the third event of our spring program of the Church in the 21st Century Center. My name is Bob Newton. I'm the interim director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, and I'm also special assistant to the president of Boston College, Father Leahy. For those of you who don't know, and there are probably a few of you, I hope, because I hope you've been to other of our events, the Church in the 21st Century Center was founded 8 years ago as Boston College's response to the clerical sexual abuse crisis in the United States and particularly in the Boston area. Our programs don't focus on clerical sexual abuse, but they focus on four focal issues. The roles and relationships of people in the church, handing on the faith, relationships and sexuality in the Catholic tradition, and the Catholic intellectual tradition. So I think you could say that the program this year, the theme of which is grace and commitment, focuses on the vocations of the laity, the roles and vocations of the laity in the church. And this semester we focused on the vocations of religious and the ordained in the church. Tonight's speaker is, I think, probably well known to all of you. We don't repeat all of the wonderful publications and degrees and all of that people have. I think John McGinty, the former director, was better at that than I was. But I think all of you know that Father Dick Clifford is a highly respected scripture scholar who began teaching at Weston Jesuit in the last century, and actually the last millennium. Started in 1970, so he's now in his 41st year. And in 2008, he was appointed the founding dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, which is many of you probably know, involved the reaffiliation of Weston Jesuit School of Theology with Boston College and the incorporation of the Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry. And I think there's a general consensus that Dick, as founding dean, bringing these two entities together in a new school, did an exceptional job. And under his leadership, the school not only established itself, but the enrollments have increased substantially in each of the years of its existence. Let me remind you that on March 16th, in this very room, at this very time, Father Daniel Harrington, who's in the back, is going to talk about the same topic, only it's going to be version number 2, Prophets and Apostles, Vocation and the Scriptures 2. So if you like what you hear today, come and hear Father Harrington. If you don't like what you hear today, come and hear Father Harrington. So you're caught, and we expect to see you all here. So let me welcome Father Dick Clifford here tonight to speak on Prophets and Apostles, Vocation and the Scriptures, Part 1.
Thank you, Bob, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be with you this evening to talk about vocation in the Old Testament. And Part 1, I noticed, and Part 2 is going to be delivered by Dan Harrington in the next following Thursday. 2 years ago, I was asked to provide a vocation story for the series Vino et Veritas, which is a series at Boston College. And accordingly, I reviewed significant events of my life, trying to identify the people, events, and ideas that led me to consider becoming a priest, a Jesuit, and a biblical scholar. And then I wove these scattered elements into a narrative and presented my story. In common with other priests and religious who have been asked to do the same exercise, I emphasize that all people, no matter who they are, have a vocation, and especially in their formative younger years, should be attentive to signs of a vocation in their daily lives. And we can return to that later in the question period. All of us, I think, have done something similar, some of us many times. And I invite you this evening to keep in mind your own story, and importantly, your own way of looking at it, your own methodology, and compare it with the calls of the human beings that we will see were called in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. I can hint at some, I will give you a hint. So I'll hint at some of the differences you might find now, and you can test them against the particular calls we'll look at in the talk. In keeping with the theocentric and the doxological perspective of the Bible, the emphasis in biblical calls is on God and on God's plans for the human race and for Israel. Even in ancient literature outside the Bible, comparable literature, deities are inescapably present in human life, and their will is always to be reckoned with. In the Bible, human vocations are usually recounted as narratives, and they're ultimately not private stories, but part of a large story of the human race or of the elect nation. Another point of difference is biblical calls are often not easy affairs, but the people call resist strongly. Only Jonah among the prophets is recorded as actually fleeing west when called to preach in the east. But several figures, notably Moses and Jeremiah, would, I think, have liked to do the same thing, at least in their initial phases of their calls. Some of the prophetic call stories, in fact, make me think of Abraham Lincoln's story when asked whether he enjoyed the office of president. He told of a tarred and feathered man out west who, as he was being ridden out of town on a rail, heard one among the crowd call to him, asking him how he liked it, high up there on his uncomfortable perch. "If it wasn't for the honor of the thing," the man replied, "I'd sooner walk." So bitter resistance is often involved in a biblical call, but so also is joy and ecstasy. I would like to start, though, this evening at an unusual place, at the very, very beginning, with the vocation of the human race in Genesis 1, before Abraham was born or Israel existed. God's creation, done in 7 days, majestically opens the Bible for both Christians and Jews. And as Mark Smith of NYU points out, the placement of Genesis 1 at the very beginning of the Bible stakes a claim, asserting the primary status of its account over and above other biblical versions of creation. Though the text offers a wealth of detail, it actually never tells us why God created this world of material, space, and time, our brave new world that has such creatures in it, as Shakespeare has said. The text only tells us what man, now I'm going to use man in the next few paragraphs, but I mean it man as male and female, and man as grouped, but I'm going to use that because that's the word that Genesis 1 delivers. The text only tells us what man, in this sense, is supposed to do. God said, quoting Genesis, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that move on the earth." In all of the creation accounts in the ancient Near East, human beings are created to be slaves of the gods, and they are meant to build and maintain temples, which are the gods' palaces on earth, feed and clothe the gods, sometimes doing so with their statues, and perform the rites and ceremonies that give the gods honor. In some accounts, creation accounts, again outside the Bible, a king is created to see that the work gets done and that the God's laws are obeyed, in which case the king is sometimes called an image or statue of the God. But Genesis 1 is different. First, there is no indication in the text that God is in need of anything. And secondly, man, male, and female, or grouped as a nation, possesses the kingly traits that elsewhere are given to the king. That's the meaning of the biblical phrase describing a human being as an image and a statue of God. In the Bible, then, human beings' vocation is less menial than in neighboring cultures, but that very fact makes it all the more difficult to find out exactly what humans are supposed to do. So what does God tell man, woman, to do? First, God blesses them. "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that move on earth." In other words, be my statue, be my image. Do what kings do, rule. Though most commentators in looking at this text take rule in an imperious and even violent sense because they interpret it as parallel with the verb to subdue, it actually stands alone, and its meaning should be gleaned from the use in the narrative. And if we let the narrative guide us, we see that Noah's way of ruling, for example, means bringing 2 of every animal in the ark to ensure the survival of each species after the flood. Now, humans at this stage were forbidden to eat meat, so that Noah's rescue of the animals was truly disinterested. In other words, Moses didn't bring in the cattle in order because he had an image of a steak dinner in the future. They didn't do that. He just wanted them to survive. The Lord further determines the vocation of man by two defining imperatives: be fruitful and be fertile rather, and increase, and fill the earth and subdue it. By the first command, God provides for the increase of the human race. Sexuality, like the seeds of the plants, is the means for overcoming our mortality and providing the next generation of human beings. As the first defining imperative was addressed to man as sexed, male and female, the second is addressed to man as grouped, that is, man as part of a nation. Each nation is to be given its own land or territory on which to live, and the process of receiving the land, filling the earth and subduing it, is described in Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, as it's sometimes called, and Genesis 11. In Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel stories, the nations gather to build a city rather than to go out and take their land. But they finally are forced to go out by God, who confuses their tongues and makes it impossible for them to cooperate in building a city. Now, land is essential to life. Food and clothing come from the land, especially at that time where there was no refrigeration and no means of transport. In short, human beings hear the mighty voice of God telling them to live life and to receive God's blessings. Let us move now, having considered the vocation of human beings, as Genesis 1 tells it, let us move now to named individuals and talk about the vocation of Noah. You probably didn't think that we were going to talk about Noah when you came here, but we are. Noah's distinctiveness is not in being the world's first boat builder, but being the first human being to whom the Bible attaches the word righteous, ish Sadiq, and the one who first, as it is said, found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Before spotting Noah, God had decided to wipe out the entire human race. And this is one of the astonishing sentences in the Bible. Looking at the depravity of the human race, the Bible tells us, the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. But then God spotted the righteous Noah, and God changed plans. He would henceforth not destroy all human beings, but only the wicked human beings. In a sense, the just Noah reminded God, as just, that God could not punish the innocent along with the wicked. And furthermore, I would suggest that Noah, in a sense, gave God an idea, a good idea, about dealing with the human race. Deal with one rather than with all, and let certain righteous individuals share in the task. Now, righteous, incidentally, means doing the will of God consciously or unconsciously. It doesn't mean we tend to think of righteous in a negative term sometimes. The last suggestion is admittedly speculative, but it makes sense when we come to our next called person, or called persons, Abraham and Sarah, or as they were called before their name change, Abram and Sarai. Now, I'm going to have to stop here for a moment and say something about God's learning curve, because when God says, I regret that I made human beings, it does, if not correctly understood, it could shock people. I was giving a talk in Texas a while back, and I made some remarks of this nature. And then there was a question period, and there was a man in the back, tall, slim, dressed in black with a little string tie and boots. And he walked slowly from the back, and I could hear the boots on the hardwood floor. And I wondered what he was going to say. And he said, I disagree with what you just said. And then he turned around and walked slowly back. You could hear it. So I never forgot that little dialogue between the two of us. So as God's learning curve, then, to return. When Genesis 6 twice says that God regretted making the world, when Genesis 2 tells us that God brought the animals to the man in the garden and waited to see what the man would name the animals, and then, ironically, when God says to Abraham in Genesis 22, when Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, his beloved son, now I know that you fear God, we have to ask ourselves, Whatever happened to divine omniscience? The best, or at least the shortest answer that I can give is that God created humans free and intelligent, and so respects that freedom and intelligence as to wait upon their decisions and actions. Characteristically, the Bible handles the question of divine sovereignty, God's all-powerful presence, and human freedom in a narrative way. God waits to see what the creature will do and then responds. Philosophically, I think you could handle the question in an entirely different way, but narratively, it is hard to think of another way to talk about God's complete sovereignty and human beings' free agency. Now let's get back to Abraham and Sarah, having clarified that. Exactly why God called them is something of a mystery. Context, however, may provide a clue to it. In the defining imperatives that I mentioned a moment ago, the be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, God charged the human race to be fertile and increase, and to fill the earth and subdue it in the sense of taking land. And as chapter 11 ended, we saw the 70 nations moving toward their lands from the east where they originated. The children of Japheth go to northern Mediterranean, to the areas associated with the Greeks, the children of Ham toward Africa, and the children of Shem to what we know as the Middle East. But God calls Abraham's family to break off from that procession, that stately procession, to take the blessings, by saying to him, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you." Notice that God says, "I will show you," and not the land to which I will give you the deed. The couple will not have a land. They will walk up and down a land they don't own. They will be sojourners, and at the end of their lives will only own a very little burial cave. Equally important, they are not fertile and increasing, but without children. And things don't look promising because Abraham is 75 and Sarah is 66. So unfit as they seem in comparison with the rest of humanity, God nonetheless calls Abraham. Why? The only reason that I can see is that God has learned something from Noah. You can begin a great project from a single family, represented by its head, in that world. So we have to ask, therefore, can we learn something more about Abraham's call? And here is what God says to Abraham in chapter 12. "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you." Notice that we are not told what Abraham was thinking, only that he went forth as the Lord had commanded him. From that moment on, he lived in a new way. He lived with the promise, but not the actualization, of land and children. Abraham and Sarah would fulfill the defining imperatives that are common to the whole human race of having children and acquiring land, but they would fulfill that divine imperative differently from the rest of the human race. Their timetable would be different because the nations had already possessed their lands and they already had descendants. So Abraham is behind the times. And the couple's dealings with God would be different from the dealings of the nations with God, for they and their descendants would deal directly with the Lord, who required of them faith in him and obedience. Somehow the nations would look on and learn from Abraham's life. As the Jewish translation has it, "All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you," which means that Abraham will become a kind of byword, Abraham and Sarah. Or as the Christians usually translate that verse, "All the families of the earth shall be blessed by you," shall be blessed by you. That's you can translate the verb either way. Abraham's response was, so to speak, spaced over the 25 years when he waited for a child, and the 75 years after Isaac was born. The stories of Abraham, about Abraham in chapters 12 to 25 are a series of episodes. They don't really, one episode doesn't necessarily generate the other. They're united by extrinsic devices. In some of these episodes, some of these scenes, Abraham and Sarah act as if they do not trust God, as when Abraham tells foreign kings that Sarah is his sister, fearing that the kings will take the beautiful Sarah into their harems and kill him as her husband. At other times, he acts with great faith hope, as when he rescues his young nephew Lot, not a particularly admirable character, and when he welcomes the three strangers into his tent, and most memorably, to all of us, I think, when he expresses his willingness to sacrifice his beloved Isaac, the boy for whom he waited 25 years. Jewish tradition interprets the Abraham cycle, I think quite nicely, as 10 trials and 7 blessings. It is the rhythm of a genuinely called person. As in the book of Proverbs, though a righteous person falls 7 times, he will get up, but the wicked collapse from just one mishap. The assumption is that the righteous person is going to fall quite a few times. The important point is he gets up, and Abraham does. Before moving on to Moses, I want to say a word about Joseph, the son of Jacob and Rachel, in the interest of adding a little spice to the pudding. Joseph's call had a unique origin, a dysfunctional family, and the pure and unadulterated hatred of his brothers, which is unusual, I suppose, for an origin of a call. His brothers sold their 17-year-old brother, stripped of his coat of many colors, still in his underwear, to a caravan of slave traders headed for Egypt. And they in turn sold the boy to an upper-class Egyptian named Potiphar. During his 22 years in Egypt, Joseph came to recognize that he was called by God rather than propelled by fantasies of dominating his brothers. 2 things, I think, helped him to see the one who was calling him: the gradual discovery of his God-given gift for interpreting dreams, and most important, his meeting with his brothers in Egypt. In a foreign country and not recognizing Joseph, these brothers, who was now a high Egyptian official, the brothers were completely vulnerable. And Joseph, I think, and I'm here maybe in a minority, was angry and had plans for revenge. He had one aim: to rescue his full brother Benjamin. Remember that Rachel had two children. Since they attacked him, as he figured they would do the same to the other son of Rachel, Benjamin. So he wanted to protect Benjamin, and he wanted to get as much grain back to his father, whom he still obviously loved, back there. And he would use the brothers' backs to bring that grain back to them. But then something wondrous happened. Joseph heard from his old nemesis Judah, the brother who had engineered the sail to Egypt. He heard Judah say something that he had never expected Judah to say. Judah said, "I will take Benjamin's place as hostage, because if Benjamin doesn't return to his father, the old man will die." And so Joseph realizes that his own plans for revenge had fallen apart, and that another plan, not of his own devising, was unfolding before him. And he was stunned and overcome. And as he is overcome, he utters one of the great lines of Scripture and bursts into tears. "I am Joseph, your brother." This recognition, this call, took years to recognize, but bitter events had taught him. From then on, Joseph used his high position as second man in Egypt to keep his family alive in famine. Notice what would have happened if they hadn't sold Joseph into Egypt. The family never would have had a patron, and therefore God took that deed of great maliciousness and turned it into a means of salvation, which to me is one of the great stories about what redemption means in the Bible. One additional point needs to be made about Joseph. The reader of the story knows the family is healed and complete when the number of sons is 12. There had been 11 sons for 22 years. And when the number of family members reaches 70 through the addition of Joseph, his wife, and the 2 sons. Note, however, that 70 is the number of the nations of the world, according to Genesis 10. And that fact reminds us of something else about vocation stories in the Bible, that Israel's own history, in a certain sense, mirrors the history of the world. And what happens to Israel and what happens to the nations have an impact on each other. What Israel does affects the nations, and it reminds us once again of the power of one. The story of Joseph brings us to the greatest instance of vocation in the Old Testament, Moses. The careers of Joseph and Moses are amazingly similar, and I think this is another point that we learn about vocation in the Bible when we consider that similarity. It is doubtful that Joseph knew that his career was going to be similar to a later character named Moses, and it's also doubtful that Moses was aware of that his career was imitating Joseph's. John Levinson has noted the remarkable parallels in the lives of these two shepherds, Joseph and who became rulers, Joseph and Moses. Both are separated from their families early on. Both survived conspiracies to murder them. Both endure exile. Both marry the daughters of foreign priests. Both have two sons. And the two leaders, one dead and one alive, leave Egypt together. But most important, both of them are commissioned by God to lead and provision an unruly people with a pronounced proclivity to reject their leaders. So thus far, Levinson. Why do you think is this cross-referencing in there at all? And I suggest it is there, and it is hoped that the reader will pick it up, that the reader will see that both of these people are engaged in a single ongoing plan. Their ignorance of the large plan then becomes a source of irony in the Bible, because we, the reader, know more than they do. So what happens to Joseph and to Moses, they might not know what's going on, and they might not be aware of the full import of their words, but we, the reader, know. And so their words sometimes have a different meaning than they think themselves they have. So like Joseph's call, Moses' calls comes at a low point in the affairs of the family of Jacob Israel. Joseph, the family patron of Egypt, has died, and a new king has arisen who did not know Joseph. The king tried to do what only a God could do: limit progeny, prevent the people from taking their own land. Operating with a patrilineal perspective of that period, that unlike modern Judaism, the father was the line was traced to the father, the king tried to destroy the people by throwing the male babies into the Nile River to drown. And Moses was born as the children of Israel were headed for extinction. Exodus 1 and 2 tells of the chaos, and one indication of the chaos of this period in the people's lives is there was no man in charge. Some people here might think that was an advantage, but in the biblical perspective, that's a sign of disorder, believe it or not. But something else took its place. All the women, all the leaders in these opening chapters of the book of Exodus are women. Knowing of Pharaoh's decree, Moses' mother steps up to the plate. She threw her male baby into the Nile, but not before placing him in a custom-designed waterproof basket. Only a resourceless woman, a woman without any other resources, one might say, could find a way both to obey an unjust command literally and make it at the same time an act of rebellion. So the 3-month-old infant floats placidly down the Nile in an ark, tevak in Hebrew, and it's the same word used of Noah's ark. In both cases, the salvation of a group rests on a boat floating on potentially lethal waters, linking us back to that earlier period. But did I say the boat was floating down the Nile? I should have said that the boat was steered by the mother straight toward the bathing spot of Pharaoh's daughter, who was evidently soft on Hebrew babies. The happy outcome was that Moses was brought up at Pharaoh's expense in his very household, with no one being the wiser about his birth. But Moses knew. When Moses grew up, he chanced upon an Egyptian brutally beating a Hebrew, as the children of Israel were known at that time. Turning this way and that, as the Bible nicely says, he struck down the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. The next day he came upon 2 Hebrews fighting and tried to mediate, thinking perhaps that his royal connection would impress them both. But one of them retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was stopped in his tracks. Not only because the murder the day before was already widely known, but also because he could not answer the question, "Who made you chief and ruler of us?" So stymied and frustrated, he fled to the safety of Midian, a place far away from Egypt on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and he found employment as a shepherd. One day, grazing his father-in-law's herd, he saw a bush burning without being consumed. "I have to go and see this strange sight," he said to himself. Approaching, he heard his name being called, "Moses, Moses." And further, "I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt and have heard their outcry, and have come down to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites." This message, we can assume, would have been music to Moses' ears, but not the final sentence. Come, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. Thus began an extended conversation. 4 times Moses raises an objection, and God answers. First objection, Moses, how can I, a nobody, deal with Pharaoh? The Lord, I will be with you and bring you back to this mountain. 2, Moses, when I go back and tell the people, who shall I tell them sent me? The Lord said, I am who am. Tell them I am sent you, thus introducing the divine name, Yahweh. 3rd, Moses, what if they do not believe me? The Lord, I will give you credibility. Here is a rod. Throw it down, it becomes a snake. Grasp it, it turns back into a rod. 4th, Moses, I am no good at public speaking, being slow of speech and slow of tongue. The Lord, who do you think made tongues and lips? Beside, I will be with you and tell you what to say. Are you getting a little bored by Moses' objections? Then I think you will excuse God's anger at what he says next. Please, Lord, send somebody else. To paraphrase God's response, that's not an option. But I will give you Aaron to assist you in speaking. Even in biblical times, Moses' reluctance to go was famous, and it influenced other prophetic calls. The 20th century scholar, the Swiss-born Walter Zimmerli of Göttingen, the professor of Old Testament at Göttingen, has classified Old Testament call narratives into 2 types. In one type, an individual is present in the assembly of divine beings who are deliberating about future events on earth. And how the prophet got there is not explained. When the Lord announces the decision, the prophet, without any hesitation and with a great deal of enthusiasm, declares, here I am, send me. And examples of this kind of call are the call of 1st Isaiah in chapter 6, the call of 2nd Isaiah in chapter 40, and in 1 Kings 22. The second type, however, is the Moses type. Here, the called person resists the call with might and main, and God has to overcome the resistance through dialogue and signs. Examples of this kind of call are the call of Gideon in chapter 6 of Judges and the call of Jeremiah in Jeremiah 1. So Moses' reluctance becomes so famous that other people like to want to use the typology. What did the Lord want Moses to do? Well, if we look upon the Exodus that is described for us in the book of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy, we can divide it into liberation from a false god, a liberation from Pharaoh's oppression, and at the same time, a work of formation, the formation of a people that is able to be the Lord's people on earth. And so Moses' call then can be divided into 2 phases, leading the process of liberation, Exodus 1 to 15, and overseeing the process of formation of the people from Exodus 16 to the end of the Pentateuch. When Moses was called, Israel was, so to speak, serving a false god, the king of Egypt, in that the Pharaoh was preventing the people's births, their right to move into their God-given territory, and was appropriating all the fruits of their labor. Liberating the people from Pharaoh was therefore Moses' first task. Come, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. The means to that end were the 10 plagues. They were both warnings to Pharaoh to cease and desist from interfering with Israel's worship. But they were also battles in the Lord's war against an unjust ruler. And the 10th plague, the taking of the Egyptians' firstborn, forced Pharaoh to his knees to acknowledge the Lord's sovereignty and to let the people go. After their rescue, when the people were safely at Sinai, Mount Sinai, the mountain of the Lord, the people opted for the Lord as their God, and Moses' task shifted to their formation. Excuse me. To be a genuine nation in that period meant having 4 elements: a God, a king or a leader, a land, and authoritative traditions. These traditions would be both narrative, you could have a story to share something, and they would have to be legal as well. So Moses set to work to fulfill his call. First of all, the people get a God. One of the interesting things about the book of Exodus is that even after God rescues the people from Pharaoh, I'm going to take a look. break here. God insists that they have the chance to vote on whether he will be their God or not. God does not assume that just because he rescued them, he is their God. So they finally decide, after a good deal of discussion, to indeed make the Lord their God. And so the God of the Father was then, that's the name they were known as in the earlier period, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was revealed in this formative hour under a new name, Yahweh. Whatever the name might mean in a strict linguistic analysis, Yahweh named a God who saw the people's misery and was moved by it, who was powerful enough to conquer Pharaoh and to lead them out of Egypt to a new and lush land, and who wanted the people to be God's people, his people. They got a leader. God called Moses, but the people assented to Moses as their leader. God did not assume that just because God called Moses, that Moses was therefore acceptable to the people. The people assented to Moses' position. As far as land goes, the possession of the land, the actual possession of the land lies in the future at the conquest. But in the meantime, they had a taste of God's land by safely dwelling in Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai. And as to traditions, the legal traditions were given directly to Moses in the mountain. And then in the course of their experience with God, they developed a narrative, and that narrative became their narrative traditions. I just want to make two final remarks on the call of vocation of Moses before moving on. The first is that Moses' public career prefigures that of the people. Note the high points of Moses' career. He becomes odious to the Egyptians, and he has to flee Egypt. He is pursued by Pharaoh as a murderer, and then he meets on Mount Sinai, called Horeb in some sources. He meets the Lord on Mount Sinai, and then in the course of conversation, agrees to be the servant of the Lord. Now what happens, what is the little course that the people go through a little bit later on? They too flee Egypt pursued by the Pharaoh. They go into the wilderness, and they too meet the Lord at Mount Sinai. And so here we find another element, or another feature of the prophetic call, that this prophet in the Old Testament, or the one called, I should say, the life of that called person prefigures what will happen to all the people. And Moses, the great servant of the Lord, par excellence in the Old Testament, illustrates that extremely well. Secondly, Moses in his speeches in Deuteronomy to Israel, the whole book of Deuteronomy is a series of 4 speeches, and he gives them to Israel, and they're ready to go over to the land of Canaan. He tells them that his teaching office, so to speak, will continue after his death. The Lord your God, says Deuteronomy chapter 18, will raise up for you a prophet from among your own people like myself. Him shall you heed. This is just what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly. And we will see that the teaching office of Moses is transferable. Moses dies, but the office of Moses continues in the person of other people. We'll see that particularly with Jeremiah. But before going on to the prophets, who are prototypically the called or the people in the Old Testament, I want to mention an unlikely person who is nearly always passed over. And that is, her name is Hannah. And she figures in the first couple of chapters in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel. She is the wife of Elkanah, who loves her dearly. And she is also unable, like other women, such as Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, to have any children. She has, unfortunately, a rival wife named Penina, who is very fertile, and Penina cannot resist the temptation to make Hannah feel inadequate by her comments. So she's a person who is suffering greatly, but much beloved. One day she went to the temple at Shiloh, the shrine at Shiloh, and she voiced her anguish and her sorrow audibly before the Lord. And the priest Eli was on duty at that time, and he mistook her audible prayers as drunken babbling. And he rebukes her. But when she corrects him and tells him that she is not drunk, but simply miserable, he gives her a blessing using the most conventional language that you find all over the Old Testament. He tells her, "Go in peace, the God of Israel grant your petition." Her own response could be regarded as entirely formulaic as well. "Let your servant find favor in your sight." Again, not original. You can find it the same thing elsewhere said. But for her, the conventional blessing of the priest Eli is, in her eyes, a promise by God that she will have a child. And her own response, while it uses formulaic language, is anything but formulaic. It's a heartfelt acceptance of a divine promise. So, in due time, she conceives and she bears a child who is called Samuel. And it was Samuel who anointed first Saul as king, and then rejected Saul and anointed David as king, stood behind David. Hannah's own acceptance of her vocation, her ability to find in conventional words something that was real and divine, strikes me as the real achievement and makes her stand out. But the other thing that makes her stand out is that she, in a broad biblical context, prefigures Mary in Luke's gospel, who would be the mother of the Son of David, just as her son made it possible for David to be king, so Mary is the mother of the Son of David. And she sings her Magnificat, which is modeled on the song of Hannah in 1 Samuel 2. But the Old Testament remembers her, I think, as the woman who was inspired by a conventional blessing to regard herself as called by the Lord to something new. And that is a turning point in the story. Now I would like to turn to the prophetic call narratives, though it means omitting other calls worthy of our attention, such as the call of Gideon. He was type 1, he was the resisting kind of call, and the call of Elisha, which is very reminiscent of the calls, Jesus' calls to his disciples. Prophetic calls show us, I think, something new and important, and it's also important for the New Testament, that biblical calls are usually tied to turns in the ongoing story of God's dealing with the nations and with the chosen nations. All the writing prophets, except for the book of Daniel, which is, for Christians, is one of the major prophets, but in Judaism is put among the writings. All of the writing prophets performed their ministry during the extraordinary events that took place in the land of Israel between 750 and 500 BC. It's a long period of time, 250 years. And during that period of time, Israel experienced, it saw the sin of Israel, the callousness of Israel at a particular time, the suffering, the death, and the resurrection of the nation. Now, the theologian preachers who monitored these events and interpreted them were the major prophets that we know, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. We have all their books. It is important to understand about these prophetic books that they were put into their present shape at the end of the 2.5 century process. It was a single process, according to the prophetic editors, that started in about 750 with the denunciations, the announcement of the sin, and that continued on until the restoration in the 6th century. And it was put into, the prophetic books were put into their present shape at the end of this 2.5 century process by 5th century or 6th century editors who were in a position to see the whole process. And what was fragmentary or incomplete in a particular prophet's writings, these people filled in. That's why you have oftentimes supplementation in prophetic books from a later time. As we know, the writing prophets suddenly appear in the middle of the 8th century with a very consistent message, even though it is a very disturbing message. The end has come upon Israel. Put in other terms, their message was that the venerable traditions that told how Israel was freed from Egyptian bondage, led through the wilderness, and safely settled in the land of Israel, these are traditions of assurance, are they not? These traditions no longer held true. There was simply too much social injustice and too little authentic worship of the Lord for Israel to continue to call itself the Lord's people and to use these old traditions. For example, Israel's traditions had it that the Lord had rescued Israel from Egyptian bondage when they were slaves and had no land, and brought them to Canaan and given each family an ample plot of land. But the reality was that wealthy landowners had formed large farms out of small family holdings that had been seized for non-payment of debts during hard times, and many Israelites returned to the Egyptian experience of having no land and being indentured servants. Small farmers, therefore, no longer possessed the land. So the story, as it was told, had ceased to have any meaning. In fact, it was just the opposite. Moreover, and another factor extrinsic to Israel's own state, great empires east of Israel in what is today Iraq, first Assyria and then Babylon, were planning invasions. So in a reversal of the old maxim that Israelites like to use, Israelites no longer sat under their own vines and under their own fig trees, and they were afraid. The prophets told them why and what they could do about it. One of the first prophets to respond to this ominous situation was Isaiah of Jerusalem, whose ministry lasted from the mid-730s to 700 BC and possibly beyond. His call or commission in chapter 6 is type 1 in the typology I proposed earlier. The prophet overhears the Lord in the divine assembly announcing a decision regarding human history, and he volunteers to make it known on earth. Here is how Isaiah describes the scene. I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. Seraphs stood in attendance, and one would call to the other, Holy, holy, holy. I cried, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Then one of the seraphs flew over to me with a live coal. He touched my lips and declared, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt shall depart, and your sin be purged away. Then I heard the voice of my Lord saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. And he said, Go say to that people, dull that people's mind, stop its ears, and seal its eyes, lest seeing with its eyes and hearing with its ears, it also grasp with its mind, and repent and save itself. Would Isaiah have accepted the call so readily if he knew the bitter message he had to deliver? The purification of Zion will take almost 2.5 centuries and involve suffering. Yet we see that in the prophets' oracles, there is the possibility of repentance. No single prophet could monitor the entire 250-year process, of course. But one prophetic book could, and it did, the book of Isaiah. As Moses had a Joshua to complete his ministry, so Isaiah of Jerusalem in the second half of the 8th century had a 6th century successor who modern scholars called the second Isaiah. And just as first Isaiah interpreted and preached at the beginning of the process, when national sin was pervasive and punishment on its way, second Isaiah oversaw the process in its final salvific phase. God, in this case, will use the foreign empire Persia to save and not to punish. Though the stage in the process that each prophet introduces is different, the two calls are very similar. Both second Isaiah stands in the divine assembly, hears the Lord's decision, and confesses his people's unworthiness, hears a word of expression, and announces that the Lord is about to lead the people on a new exodus to Zion. And the book goes on to describe that new work in terms of creation and of Exodus. If we reflect on the account of the two Isaiahs that we have seen, we cannot help but notice that the accounts provide no information on the psychology of the individuals, but really are interested in what God is doing through the prophet. The main actor is the Lord, surrounded by heavenly courtiers, announcing a decision about the course of human history. And now I would like to turn from Isaiah, which is a book of great depth and detail, to talk about the two last prophets I will talk about, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. As I mentioned before, Jeremiah's call echoes Moses' call. Then I said, Ah, Lord God, truly I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am only a boy, for you shall go to all whom I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. Now I have put my words in your mouth. Like Moses, Jeremiah's life anticipated what would later happen to all the people. His famous confessions in chapters 12 to 20 are not meant to display his gut reaction to God's heavy demands in a kind of true confession style. They are rather exemplary laments of a servant of God who foresees the destruction of Israel's religious institutions and wants to show others how to make it through the night. They are exemplary because in the midst of his angry complaints, he still believes in a faithful God. And so in making publish his anguished personal prayers, he accomplishes two things. He announces to the people the destruction that is coming, and he provides them with a means for managing the trauma. Pray the laments as I have prayed them, he says. Complain freely, but do not lose your ultimate conviction that God will see you through this. Similarly, Ezekiel was told to build a miniature vision of Jerusalem with a few bricks, and then to bring in a kind of toy instruments of a siege, and to set his face against the city. In other words, to act out the siege that was coming so the people could know what was happening. With his body, the prophets let the people know the terrors that are coming to show them that they can survive if they trust God will see them through it. This is really street theater, and it's not using words so much as the prophet's body to act out what will happen in the future and how they might live through the suffering that is coming their way. In conclusion, I would like to just make 4 conclusions about what these prophetic calls teach us about vocation and about calls. I do so because I know that some of the biblical emphases are not modern emphases, but it's very helpful, I think, to compare our own experience with the biblical experience, even when we know it's quite different, in order to see the contrast and be instructed by the contrast. The first thing that strikes me when I look at the prophetic calls depicted in the Old Testament are that the Bible has a theocentric and a doxological viewpoint. By doxological, I mean they're interested in displaying the glory of God. And that leads them to put the emphasis upon God calling or defining. And again, that sometimes contrasts with the way we sometimes look at our own vocations, where the emphasis is upon our own selves and our own experience. Second difference, or second emphasis on the Old Testament. Many Old Testament calls are linked to turning points in the history of the human race, or turning points in the history of God's dealing with Israel. The called person announces that particular turning point and is also charged with eliciting the people's participation or acceptance of the divine plan. A third emphasis that is in the Old Testament calls is that the person called may not know the extent of the divine plan. Just as I mentioned that Joseph did not know that Moses' career would follow his own, or that Moses did not know that Joseph's career had already taken place in a manner similar to his. But the mirroring, this kind of thing, lets us know that a plan is unfolding that is God's, and that the human actors and agents may take a part in that plan, but they may not know the full extent of it or where it is ultimately going. And lastly, accepting the call may involve suffering, for the plan that the called person announces and oversees is the divine will. And as we know from the Bible over and over again, God's plans are often at odds with human plans, so that it's almost inevitable if you get called that it will not be an easy decision, an easy life. So anyway, these are what I have gleaned from working through the Old Testament. You may have comments and questions of your own, but thank you for your attention.